This episode contains offensive language and sensitive topic discussions. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to Full Disclosure, a podcast project conceived to let me spend more time with interesting people than I would ever get to do on the radio. This week's guest fits into that category approximately 20 times over. Hanif Kureishi, welcome.
Watcha.
Preparing for this interview was an odd, possibly unique experience because in a way there are two subjects of the interview. There is Hanif Kureishi and his body of work, his extraordinary body of work, and then there is the writer of the new memoir who on Boxing Day of 2022, for people who don't know, suffered an extraordinarily life-changing injury which has rendered you tetraplegic, which is why today you're in your wheelchair and talking to me for the first time ever from a slightly higher perspective as the subject of the interview than I've ever done. Where do those two people meet?
Well, I remember being in the ICU in the Gemelli Hospital in Rome, and I was well drugged up and certainly surprised and shocked about what had happened to me. But I remember shouting at my partner Isabella that I wanted to write something. And she sat at the end of my bed with a telephone and tapped into the phone my first blog. So I had a very strong desire to get back to work, but to communicate with the world and to speak about what had happened to me, to try and organise it. And of course, because I can't use my hands, I had to make up the blog in my head and see it visually, the paragraphs piled on top of one another, and try and remember it and then say it to her. She would then type it in her phone, and then my other son, Carlo, would put it on a platform called Substack and then on Twitter. And that was really important to me. It was one of the first things that I did when I came round from consciousness. So the instinct to be a writer is right at the centre of my being, and the desire to turn experience into words is very strong in me. And I think I had that from the time I was a teenager. When I was a teenager, I decided I wanted to be a writer. And I have to say, the suburbs in those days where I come from, South London suburbs, Bromley, it was pretty rough for Asian families and people of colour. So I wanted to write about that.
So that's the only thing that hasn't changed at all then, that impulse?
It comes out of trauma, I guess, or out of some kind of difficulty or suffering, for me at least, and I'm sure for other people, the desire to write down your experience and to share it with other people and to feel that you're not alone in what you're going through.
Which is the universal drive, isn't it, regardless of what experiences it is you're drawing on. When I read the first dispatch, I can't remember precisely where I was, but it was traffic stopping. I thought that possibly there was some sort of scam underway. I thought you were about to start asking for money, and it would be one of those glorified Facebook cons where someone says I've had all my... Because it read so implausibly, that the nature of the accident. For people who don't know, you were watching a football game on your iPad and you felt a bit faint, you keeled over, and the way in which you landed is responsible for the damage that's been done to your spine.
I fainted. I put my head between my legs, as you're supposed to do. I blacked out, and then apparently I stood up, took a step across the room, called for Isabella, and then I fell slap bang on my face, and I broke my neck in whiplash. And I woke up on my head with this stuff around me that turned out to be blood. And I looked around And I thought I saw these animals crawling towards me. And then I realized it was my hands, and that I'd become completely disconnected from the rest of my body. My body was like an alien thing that I was in, and I couldn't breathe so well. And I thought, this is what it's like to die. You're going to die, mate. You're going to die now, because you're just going to run out of breath. And it's a bit, you don't know what to do when you're dying. It's a bit awkward. I mean, and I decided, I told Isabella I wanted to say goodbye to the kids. I wanted to FaceTime Sash and Carlo and Kia, my kids, and wave goodbye to them. It seems funny now. She wouldn't allow me to do that. She said they'll get a bit of a shock. They'll be in Soho House having a drink, and they're going to see their dying father waving at them. She said it's not such a...
Did she think you were dying as well then, at that point?
She didn't know, but she was very, very frightened. And then they took me away to the hospital, and it broke my life in two.
And in some ways, the new book is both an account of and a thank you letter for all the people that have looked after you subsequently and sort of got you to where you are today. And of course, to your family and your boys for helping you to get your story out there.
Well, when you have an accident like mine, this extraordinary thing happens, which is that everybody else around you is thrown into disarray by it. Their lives are devastated. It's like a bomb going off in the family. They're profoundly affected. Then they have to start doing stuff they never thought they would be doing, which is like looking after you in your bed and worrying about you and organising a rota so that you're taken care of and so on. So you call up inadvertently all these resources in other people that you normally wouldn't ask them to do. And that's when you see the love.
There's a tension in a lot of the writing that you've done since, when it comes to the people who've looked after you and who continue to look after you. And you're quite hard on yourself, aren't you? You're quite hard on your pre-accident self when you wonder about whether you would have been similarly supportive of friends in the same circumstances, the friends that visit you, the friends that come to you, that enjoy your company, but are also, clearly in a supportive role, not just a sociable one.
Yeah.
It did. One thing struck me was that you must have been a bit nicer than you allow in order to have inspired that sort of friendship and affection subsequently.
I found out that I got a lot of friends.
Yeah.
And I've got a lot of new friends still, people coming to visit me that I haven't seen for years. I mean, an actor that I worked with once, he would ring up Isabella and he would come in and bring me flowers and chocolates and sit with me and gossip to me. And I hardly knew the guy and I hadn't seen him for 20 years, but he wanted to come, show his respects. A lot of people were like that. They were just incredibly kind, just sending messages. Vague people like the landlord of the pub and all kinds of people that you would not expect that from were incredibly generous and kind. So I suddenly saw the way in a world I hadn't seen it before. I was an independent person living at home, writing my books, living with Isabella, and seeing the kids, now and again in the usual way. So I didn't require all this love and support, and suddenly I can't live without it. So somehow I've opened the door to the rest of the world to come in. And of course, extraordinary experiences with nurses and with doctors, both in Italy and the NHS here in the UK. You're incredibly intimate straight away with some nurse that's arrived recently from South Africa, and she's washing you and singing and talking to you, and you have an intimacy. You can ask her anything. How are your kids? What was your school like? And so on. And you get close to people that you would never normally meet. So I would say that breaking your neck is a very good way to make new friends.
Let's back up then to what you were doing prior to breaking your neck that created this groundswell of affection that came in response. You've mentioned developing a desire to be a writer at a very young age. I mean, it's a really young age that you knew you wanted to be a writer, and respectfully, there wasn't a great deal going on academically that necessarily, in a school context, that necessarily supported the ambition, I don't think.
Yeah, I was dumb as fuck at school. I really was, and I wasn't interested. But I was a young and a really interesting time called the 60s and through the 70s. And so I lived in a parallel universe of incredible music, incredible literature coming from the United States mostly, and of course magazines like The NME and then Rolling Stone and so on. So, I didn't let going to school get in the way of my education, which was really freelance and through the radio and TV shows about music and so on. So I am educated despite the efforts of the state.
It's rare that, and maybe it was unique to that era, but you because you read voraciously. You even kept a record of everything you'd read that was running, I think, up to about 80 books a year, but you were barely troubling the scorers when you were at school. You didn't get into grammar school. So where did the confidence come from? Is that of the era as well, the idea that you didn't need the traditional foundation stones, the traditional grounding, in order to go off like a rocket into the world of literature or the world of culture?
Well, it was because of the Beatles.
How do you mean?
Well, they were an example. They were not so well educated. They were lower middle class or even working class. They had this talent. They came to London and they were outside the conventional way of moving through British society. And of course then there were other bands and so on. And a lot of kids from my school got involved in photography. They got involved in fashion, punk, and with Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren and so on. So there was, as I say, a sort of alternate world where you could be creative. I mean, you know this country. What's good about this country is how creative it is. What's great about this country are the young people who are in bands, who are doing music and making films and making TV and so on. That's what I love about London and why I came to London.
And how quickly did you feel part of it? Because a lot of your writing is, a lot of your characters, or the more autobiographical characters, are simultaneously insider and outsider, aren't they? So how quickly did you feel that you were part of the world that you were transfixed by?
Well, what you say is interesting because there aren't many mixed-race kids in the media. When I was growing up, our parents had just arrived. My dad from India, and we were just sort of getting started, beginning to move through the social system. Now you've got Rishi Sunak, and you can thank India for that and the empire. But we were just beginning. But I got some breaks. I went to work at the Royal Court Theatre. I worked at Riverside Studios. I worked at the Royal Shakespeare Company.
But at a very young age. This is in your late teens.
Yeah. I was there at a young age.
How did that happen?
Early
what
20s.
were you doing? Were you banging on doors? I know that I don't know if precocious is the right word to use, but there's an unpublished novel that the publisher enjoyed enough to come and visit you in your home, and he'd come round quite regularly. So they'd seen something that your teachers hadn't taken the time to identify, I think. But your dad had faith in you from the start.
My dad had faith in me. He was a writer, failed writer, I guess, who worked in the Pakistan embassy. He wanted me to be a writer. I come from a family of writers. My son Sachin was also a writer, so it's not unusual for us to be writers. I guess I was talented. And I had a subject, which is something that really matters a lot. As you know, you're a writer yourself. You've got to have a subject. It's not only that your ability to write, but you've got to have something in the world that you can engage with. And for me, it was really beginning to tell the story of how Britain had changed after the war in terms of its racial democratic, on our way to becoming a multiracial, multicultural society. And those stories hadn't been told, really. And it was there for me. It was an opportunity.
And did you have a sense of gravity about that? Did you think this is an aligning of the planets? Not only is this a moment of enormous importance historically and culturally, but few people are going to be better qualified than me to chronicle it. Or would that have been too pompous?
You're in it.
Yeah.
You're a subject of history. history crisscrosses you, whether you like it or not, mate. Your father coming from India, your mother being a white working class woman who marries a man of colour. And when you go to school and people call you a Paki, you're in history, mate. There is hundreds of years behind that word. And you can write out of that.
And does that perspective help you deal with it? I mean, would it, again, verging from pomposity to amateur psychology, but if you're on the receiving end of that sort of abuse, but you're simultaneously conscious of the historical moment that you're in and you know you're going to write about it, does it diffuse some of the nastiness at all?
It's to do with agency.
Yes.
You're actually doing something. Someone's abusing you, and you're just a victim. You're nothing at that moment. He's degrading you, but you can have agency over that language, over that world, by turning it into a song or a poem or a book or whatever, or even in my case into a comedy, which my first novel, The British Suburbia, really was. Even though racism, as you know, is not a laughing matter, you can write a comedy about someone like me who has to go through all that and then rises above it to make a life.
Your first published novel, because I think you'd been writing furiously before that one got
my first published novel was The Buddha, which was in 1990, but I'd written My Beautiful Laundrette.
Of course. Oscar nominated. For people who don't know.
Years before, yes. And so I worked in the film business.
And that line agency is very relevant to the events that we began this interview by discussing. So in a way, in the same way that, if it's a person being horrible to you, or if it is fate being horrible to you, you reclaim something through that agency of the creative process of writing about things.
Well, you're trying to understand. What's my dad doing in the UK? How did he get here? What's the relationship with India? And why is he not pal saying all that stuff directly to me in my face? And how can I object? How can I turn that into something that's my own? And you're also aware that in the 70s it was very, very hard time for people of colour. And of Asian background, any Asian person of my age will tell you that it was very heavy, particularly with the fascism of the National Front and the BNP and the Enoch Powell and the casual racism on the streets that we faced all the time. But there was resistance. There was Rock Against Racism, there was The Clash and other bands and so on. And we fought back and we got somewhere.
And that duality, isn't it? The mixed race experience, but the way that you would be, and you've spoken in the past about coming home every day covered in spit. There'd be people who wouldn't let you go to their houses, parents who wouldn't let you visit your friend's house, teacher who referred to you as Pakistani P. But you never doubted your right to belong, I don't think. That it's probably rare for someone in your position. You always felt you had as much right as anybody else to be part of this music, to be part of this culture, to be part of this country.
Yeah, I did. My dad went to public school in India, and my dad was much more entitled than me.
Yeah.
And posh. And he thought he could go anywhere and talk to anyone. And he would talk to anyone on the street, up and down the road he'd walk, and talk to all the men as they were washing their cars on Sundays. And so my dad was really proud to be in England. And he really loved England, and he really loved the suburbs, and he liked the people there, despite the fact that, a skinhead would chase you down the street as soon as look at you. He still loved it. And so we're grateful to England. And we're grateful to England for giving us the opportunity to believe that we can do something here.
Do you think that class issue is partly why he's not a stereotype in the context of the immigrant experience, is that he wasn't desperate for you to be a lawyer or a doctor or an accountant or whatever, and he was keen for you to actually pursue his own dream, which turned out to be your dream as well?
It's unusual in an Asian family for the parents want the kid to be some kind of an artist or an actor, normally they'd say, well, how are you going to make a living, mate? Why aren't you a lawyer or a doctor, and so on. There were plenty of doctors in my family, going back generations. But it was a great period, the 60s, 70s, for artists. David Bowie came from the suburbs. He'd been to the school that I later went to. So there was a unique period, I think, and a small bit of paradise, I think, that after the war generation. My dad used to say to me, it's incredible, he'd say, Hanif, you go to school and it's free. You go to the doctor and it's free. You go to the dentist, it's free. What a life this is. What a kind of great country this is.
Yeah.
It's a shame all that's over now, isn't it, James?
Not all of it, but we're certainly heading in that direction. And,
yeah.
And you mentioned Bowie. Again, I don't want to use the word ease, but I'm envious of the way that you could actually meet your heroes in that. That's, again, a small bit of paradise where the invisible wall between the superstars and the admirers was not as concrete as it is now.
David Bowie and I had the same art teacher. It was a man called Owen Frampton. And we both loved painting and drawing and being in the art room. And Owen Frampton's son was a guitarist called Peter Frampton, who later on played with David Bowie. And David Bowie really liked my book, The Buddhist of Bowie. He had read it, and he read a lot, David Bowie. In fact, he gave me a lot of books. He just hand them out to you when you were with him. And he's a genius and a great man, but he also is a very modest man and a man who's really interested in other people.
Yes. I love the line when you finally got around to asking him whether you could use some of his music for the Buddha of Suburbia adaptation. And he sort of said, I thought you'd never ask.
Yeah, that knocked me out.
Yeah, I bet it
That
did.
really knocked me out. That really blew my head off.
When did you realise you were good, Hanif? When did you realise? Because at 19, as we've said, you're at the Royal Court. You'd spent time, I think, flogging programmes at the RSC. You'd got yourself into the world that you wanted to be in. But when did you start to think that you actually might be able to do work that would keep you there?
That's a very hard question, an interesting question, because no one ever thinks they're good, do they?
No.
You're never good enough. You can always do better, can't you? I still think that. I'm still learning to be a writer, to write. I want to write a movie about my experience, but do I know how to write movies? Can I write movies? I've written 10 movies. They've all been made, but I still doubt myself. So you asked me, when did I know that I was good? I guess you know you're good when people pay for your work.
Yeah.
They they want to go and see a play of yours, and they'll hand over a tenner, and you think, well, that is at least a guarantee of something. But I knew that I was good because my dad never got his work published or his plays put on, but I did, and I did quite quickly.
And there's serendipity there as well. We'll move on to, because you were in an era where the rewards were big, weren't they? I mean, this was quite a rock and roll time to be a writer, and that happened quite quickly for you as well. But the first thing you got was a play produced at the Royal Court, I think.
Yeah, I wrote plays for the Royal Court, became writer in residence there. I had a play done at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and I worked in the theatre for a while, where I learned an enormous amount about writing. And then Mrs. Thatcher started Channel 4. And Channel 4 at that time was a very, very interesting TV outlet, because they would make movies for television with low budgets, with people like Ken Loach and Stephen Frears and Neil Jordan and Angela Carter and so on. So it was fantastic to be involved in this new cinema movement in the UK, paid for by television. So I wrote My Beautiful Laundrette, which was the first time I'd ever written a movie, and really that came out of my dad sending me to see a friend of my family, and saying, listen, my son Hanif, he's never going to be a writer. Do you think you can get him a job running a laundrette? And I would go around these really shitty laundrettes around South London, and I thought, why don't I write a story about a bloke running a laundrette? That's how it kicked off.
And the love affair between the Asian lad and the skinhead and the white skinhead, which again brings together, because some of the lads you'd been at school with had gone on to be skinheads. They'd got into that scene, as you've said already, Enoch Powell. So again, you're bringing together the two.
That's what writing does. You know, you've got a lot of stuff floating around in your head all day, every day. You begin to write it down, you put it together in some kind of shape, and then you turn it into a story. So that's the alchemy, you might say, of being an artist. I was at school with a lot of kids who became skinheads. I had an uncle who had a laundrette. I knew Asian women who were in arranged marriages and so on. I had another uncle who was a kind of slum landlord. So all these bits and pieces you put into the pot, you stir it up, and then you make a story out of it.
And in many ways, you were the first person to write about a lot of those things from the inside, without sounding like a tourist or without having distance. You know, actually just the relationship between sex and arranged marriages, and which is quite a big theme in Buddha, isn't it? And just doing it in a completely matter-of-fact way. You could have been writing about something quite moribund, but you weren't. You were writing about stuff that was potentially complicated and sexy because it was what you were living.
Well, I wanted to write comedies, and I wanted it to be dirty, and I wanted it to be punky. You know, I come out of the 70s. The most important cultural events really have been around punk. And punk have permeated photography and also cinema, like Derek Jarman and so on. So My Beautiful Laundrette has a kind of soft, punky element to it. And the Dan Day-Lewis character's got a kind of punky side to him. So there's a lot of that thrown into the pot as well.
And again, you're straddling, because when you were at the Royal Court, you would be party to conversations, I think, involving people like Lindsay Anderson and Samuel Beckett, very, very pre-punk, although I don't imagine either of them have ever been described as that before.
Yeah.
But you had a foot in that tradition as well.
What you learn from the Royal Court is really about social realism.
Yes.
What you learn about the Royal Court is that the attempt of the Royal Court was to put people on the stage who hadn't been in the theatre before, i.e. mostly working class people, and you can see that with Look Back in Anger from 1956 and so on. But then the next wave of people who hadn't been and portrayed in the media were really people of colour, Afro-Caribbean people, and all the new immigrants and their kids after that, and the way Britain was beginning to change in relation to all that. So as I say, that material hadn't really been touched at that time.
And yet you make it sound like a natural progression, actually. If it is I think Amos wrote something once, didn't he, about we used to write about gods, and then it was emperors, and then it was kings, and then it was this, and now finally it's
dentists.
Yeah. I don't think he said, did he say dentists? That's you say dentists. But completely ordinary existences as opposed to gilded ones.
Yeah. And those stories are fascinating.
Sorry.
Those stories are fascinating stories.
Yes.
You know, people came from Pakistan, and one of them would be working as a waiter, and then he'd get together with 3 other waiters and then buy a house, and you know, they rent it out and then buy another house. I mean, these are great stories.
And had you yearned, because it happened so quickly for you, was there time to yearn for it? Did you yearn to be in that world, or were you in it almost as soon as you decided that you wanted to be?
As soon as I got on that train from Bromley South and I got to Victoria, I got into London, I was whooping down the street. I thought, this is London, this is Carnaby Street, this is the King's Road, this is sexy, this is fun. You know, the people are beautiful and they're artists. And that really suited me, and I got out when I was quite young, and I got to be where I wanted to be in this great city as an artist.
And you never really looked back. A brief word really on, I suppose, your relationship at university was pretty much the same as your relationship with school, wasn't it? It just the two cogs never really bit.
I got chucked out of my first university. My dad, he opened the envelope, and he said, and there were like 5 Fs, and he said, What is F? He kept saying, what is F? What does F mean? Why have you got F? And I said, I'm afraid, Dad, F stands for failure, you know. And my dad had a heart attack. Yeah, poor fellow. He was so upset. But later on, I did go back to university. I went to King's down the road in the Strand, and I read philosophy. And it was very handy for me to be in London at that time, because this was a great period of the Sombrero, the Blitz Club, all the pubs at the end of the King's Road, like the Roebuck and the World's End and so on. It was a fantastically creative period in British culture, really. Probably the last great period, I would say, which was punk.
And you were up to your ears in it?
Well, you wouldn't catch me in bondage trousers, to be honest, James.
Really?
I really wouldn't
apart
go,
from that,
that
apart from the bondage trousers, you were fully immersed.
I loved it, but I kept away from the safety pins, I have to say. But it was so energetic and so British.
I don't want to gloss over the extent of your early success. I've already used the word precocious, but the 10 years you spent writing the plays, you're picking up things like the George Devine Award twice, I think. Then you become writer in residence relatively quickly. It's 85, you write the screenplay for My Beautiful Laundrette, which, as you say, Stephen Frears directs. Daniel Day-Lewis essentially kicks off his career with it. You're 29 years old, you're living in a housing co-op in West London, and you get an Oscar nomination.
That was a bit of a shock. I was living with my girlfriend in a housing association flat, very, very small. We had to go down to Oxfam and get the DJs. She got her dress on and everything, and off we went to Los Angeles. We were in a limousine, and we were at literally at the Oscars. I was sitting next to Betty Davis. It can only happen to you once.
Yes.
That stuff.
The magic wand stuff.
Yeah, you can't do that again because you're expecting it happens to you once. And then I went around Los Angeles. I met interesting people. I was offered lots of jobs. I started to make money. It was an incredible period. And also, it was the 80s in London, which was a really good period because Groucho Club had just opened. Advertising and media companies had started. Soho was beginning to change. There was more money in Soho, more young people in Soho. It was and also probably the most important thing was probably the arrival of Salman Rushdie in our lives, who I met in probably in around 82, 83, I think. And he had a big impact on London, and winning the Booker Prize with Midnight's Children and being the person he was. I mean, it was sort of dazzling. He was so smart, and this book was so brilliant. He thought, fucking hell, I've really got to get my game up now. This guy is so clever, and he knows everybody, and he's read everything, and he goes to the movies every night and talks about this, that, and the other with such intelligence. It was it really sort of stunned London. It was very important when he kind of turned up for all of us younger writers.
All younger writers, not just younger writers of Asian background.
Because British writing then with him became much more international. It suddenly became what's called, I guess you could call it, world writing.
Yes.
That he brought into his own writing people like Marquez and Gunter Grass and Indian myths and so on. And you thought, well, he's really opened it up here in a new way.
And he didn't really write about the diaspora. Or, I mean, he can and he has, but in Midnight's Children, it's the magical realism. It's the doing amazing things with words. It's
the invention.
Yes.
And the intelligence and the talent. The British writing had been quite insular, really, up until that point. There were writers like Iris Murdoch and Angus Wilson and so on who were, they were quite small-time writers. They were good writers. He really opened it up, and meeting him and being with him and hanging around in his house and so on, you suddenly were in a social world that was quite different to the one I've been in before.
Were you ever socially awkward, Hanif? Did you always have your dad's confidence in these kind of contexts where you'd feel comfortable almost anywhere, even if you're feeling humbled by somebody else's talent, you're not feeling cowed?
That's a really good question. That's a really interesting question.
Thank you.
Have you ever met anybody who isn't socially awkward?
well, I presume I might have done, but they'd be sociopaths. I suppose we give it away to differing degrees, don't we?
Yeah,
So
Donald Trump probably wouldn't feel socially
Yeah.
awkward. The narcissist probably wouldn't feel socially awkward.
No, but apart from them. So you would then? You clearly would.
Yeah. Well, the difference between people who are socially awkward and those who are not are those who would get over it.
Yeah. Okay.
So you go to a party, you'd stand out there with your bottle, looking in through the window and thinking, I'm not going in there, mate. I really can't. But you go in. And the ones that go in get over it, and then you're the guy in the room looking out at the other guy who's awkward. So you battle with yourself, don't you?
Yes.
I've been in terrifying scenes with movie stars and directors or people like David Bowie and Brian Eno and so on, and you think, who am I? I remember going to Wembley Stadium with David Bowie to see U2. On the night that Salman Rushdie appeared on stage with Bono, wearing the devil's horns.
Yeah.
And I remember walking into Wembley Stadium, and there must have been like 80,000 people there with David Bowie. And everybody turned around and looked at David Bowie, and you could feel this rush through the audience as Bowie. And I was standing next to him, and I thought, they must be thinking, who the fuck is that little guy standing next to him in those awful clothes? Bowie just stood there and took it. It was incredible to see that. But it's an interesting question about social awkwardness. I really think so. And I think most sensible people would feel it and be intimidated by it, yeah.
But you push through. And it's different for the writer as well, perhaps, because you know that, in a sense, everything potentially is material, even the awkwardness, even the experience of all those people turning around and not knowing who you were. Although you were the bloke standing next to Bowie, so that's the second best thing to be in that.
Well, I learned when I was in the hospital for a year, I learned that, you're lying there, you're bored out of your mind. Also, you're ill, you're paralysed, you can't use your hands, your life has been changed. All you've got is your ability to make conversation with these people around you, whether they're from the Philippines or Namibia or whatever. You say, have you got kids? Where do you come from? What's your house like? What were your parents like? And off you go. It's easy to unpeel people if you really, really want to do it, because people really want to tell you their stories.
And if you're genuinely interested.
You hear things that are
that
you would never have heard otherwise.
So is this you as your father's son again? Is this the ability to talk to anybody anywhere, or?
You have to make up your mind whether you want to be friendly, whether you want to connect with people, or you can lie there like a stone.
Did you do that? Were you conscious of that process, or did you just realise you'd come out the other side of it once you'd come out the other side of it?
I was so broken.
Yes.
I was in such a terrible state of anxiety and loneliness and horror and terror of the trauma I'd been through, that making a conversation with someone who is washing your body is a consolation. And funnily enough, a lot of the people who looked after me, a lot of the nurses, you'd hear things, you'd say, why did you become a nurse? And they would tell you, I became a nurse because one day I was with my kid brother and he fell off the roof. And I want to spend the rest of my life looking after people who were hurt like him. Or my father had Parkinson's or whatever. And you'd suddenly see that there's a history of injury and hurt in all families, that I'm not an exception. I think I'm an exception. God chose me to have this accident. But there's accidents in every family. And you can see that if you ask the right questions.
Has the nature of your curiosity changed then? Your curiosity about other people?
Yeah. I'm really interested in hospital stories.
Yeah, of course.
People would come visit me in the room and they say, how are you? And then they say, I've got a bit of a cold, actually.
I don't want to complain. But since you ask.
And they would tell you their stories of illness and recovery and their families, their parents and so on. So, and you would never normally ask, have there been any illnesses in your family? You would never ask that, except you would in a hospital. So I began to see that there's no line between illness and health. They're interconnected all the time.
At what point did you, I know you've written about this, but I'd like to ask you personally, when you started to feel hopeful again?
When I wrote the first few blogs with Isabella, and then I wrote more of them with my son Carlo, and Carlo put them on Twitter, and then we started to get lots of inquiries from newspapers and journalists and radio people, TV people from all over the world. Straight away, it became huge. Someone wrote an article about me in the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times, foreign newspapers, Germany, France, Spain. So I began to think I can connect with people again. I've got something to do with my life, which is I get up in the morning and I write this stuff down through Carlo, and I can communicate with people. And then after a bit, Carlo said we should do this as a book. We can put all this together in a book. So then I got a book deal. I got a really good book deal from a very good publisher, Penguin. So I had something to live for. When I woke up this morning, I thought, I'm going to see James O'Brien today. I'm not going to sit in my house looking at the wall. I can't really travel. It's very difficult for me to travel because of my various reasons.
Of course.
I can't get on the train, go to Paris or fly to New York or anything. So I live in a much smaller world. But that small world means a lot to me, like meeting you or working with journalists.
And making connections with people that you'll never meet and knowing that your work is still landing.
Well, we publish the blogs, but we get scores of letters.
Yeah, I'm sure.
From people who tell you about their illnesses. I mean, some of them, they write 1,000 words about how fucked up they are, how their lives are ruined, and how they can't walk, and this, that, the other. And it's very moving to connect with these stories.
The memoir is called Shattered, so it's not a kind of story of overcoming the odds or anything like that, is it? It's much more important than that.
Well, it's about receiving this huge blow. When I was in Stanmore Hospital in North London, I was on a ward that was only for people with my kind of injuries, spinal cord injuries. And I wrote a blog, and it's called The Hospital of Accidents. And everybody on the ward had an accident. It didn't have, degenerative diseases or whatever. So there was a little kid at the end of the ward who used to smoke dope all the time. He used to drive the nurses bonkers. You'd see them running up and down the ward screaming, opening the windows. This little kid was like 19 years old, and he'd fallen off a trampoline and broken his neck. And he shared a room with another little kid who'd jumped into the sea and hit a sandbank and broken his neck. And then there was another guy who went to bed one night drunk and fell out of bed and broke his neck. And there were loads of people in there who'd fallen down the stairs. And there was another guy who trod on a rake in the garden, turned around, fell on his head and broke his neck. So you suddenly become aware. You be careful, James. When you're in your bathroom, you're probably in the most dangerous place in the world. That these accidents, these contingencies, you have got no control over them. There's nothing you can do about them. You could be hit by a rock, you could fall over, you could twist your ankle, be hit by a car. There are lots of people in there who've been hit by cars. A lot of people on bicycles have been run over, motorcycles, particularly in Italy where they got a lot of potholes. That the world is a random, contingent and cruel place, and you can't control it as much as you might like to.
But we've probably spent more time thinking about the fragility of life itself, as in it can end in a cruel twist of fate, as opposed to the fragility of what we take to be normal life itself. That's one of the things you address, isn't it, in what you just said as well, the absurdity and the fragility.
It's absurd. One day I was walking around Rome, thinking about what I was going to have for supper, And the next day I'm a quadriplegic, and I'll never go back. There's no going back, and I'm entirely dependent on other people for my well-being, for a glass of water. But I can speak. You can hear me now. I can speak. My wife sometimes describes me as a talking vegetable, and I can still annoy her and other people with my speech. So it didn't affect my brain, my injury.
Are you surprised that the people who love you have stayed so close?
You make this demand when you have an accident, and others respond or they don't respond. But you'd never see that unless you had an accident. You wouldn't know until then what they would do. I don't think they would know. So I would find that people would come to my hospital bed and they would cook a 3-course meal. And they'd bring it into my room and they'd sit down there and then they'd feed me. And then they would brush my teeth. Then they would give me a head massage. Then they would read to me until I fell asleep. So you'd see people doing incredible things, people you didn't know necessarily so well who would volunteer to do stuff that you would never normally ask them to do.
But the people you did know very well, the people who were closest to you, did you fear that they might not stay as close?
Yeah. I mean, your terror is of being left alone.
Yes.
That they will abandon you. And if you're left alone, there's literally nothing I can do except talk. I can't phone anybody out. I can't open a computer. I can't play a record. So you're constantly in a state of terror that someone's going to walk out of the room and leave you alone and not come back. And particularly with, my partner. She didn't sign up to look after a tetraplegic. And then one day she has to look after a tetraplegic, or she could leave, which she wouldn't want to do. But it's a huge burden on her. Huge adjustment for her, and terrible for her to look after someone like me.
Some of the interviews I've read suggest that she might reject parts of that analysis, but it would never stop feeling terrible from where you are.
Well, I feel guilty.
Yes.
About what I've done to the people around me and what I demand of them. My son Carlo and also my son Sashin, they come to my house every damn morning. And they come in at 10 o'clock, they sit down with their computers and they write down what I say. I mean, that's an incredible act of... I pay them. I pay them, but it's an incredible act of loyalty and love.
And they get to spend time with their dad as well, which is something that we don't always value until it's too late sometimes.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, how much of your success did your dad see? How much of it did he witness?
My dad died between my writing the Buddha of Suburbia and the Black album. So he saw me nominated for an Oscar, he saw my books being published and so on, and I was his project. You know, Indian fathers are like sports fathers, really. You know, we've come to England and we've come here to get on with things.
And you did.
Not to laze around, yeah.
You pulled it off.
Yeah.
I can't remember who said this, you probably will. It might have been Ian McEwan about you can't really become a writer until your parents are dead. I don't think you ever suffered from that feeling. I don't think you're any more clear-eyed in your writing the autobiographical elements of your work after you lost your dad. For example, your mum is still alive and you're quite comfortable describing her in terms that are unflattering. You've never felt handcuffed by potential reactions to your work.
Well, first of all, your parents are never dead anyway. No one's ever dead in that sense. They never leave you. I still think about my dad. I'm 70. I think about him every single day. I think something or other about him. What would he think about that? Or he'd be annoyed about that. And I will haunt my kids when they are sitting here when they're 70 years old as well. But to be a writer, yeah, you have to, I guess, not be embarrassed or bothered about looking at tough things. And books have to say tough things. That's why we write them, and that's why people read them, to hear things about the world that are just beyond their understanding, you might say.
Which makes the new book such a sort of, I mean, it's such an odd thing to have happened to anybody, odd being a completely inadequate word, but the role that you have given yourself in writing Shattered actually fits with a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about today, doesn't it? The providing a guide to something for people who would not otherwise understand it.
I think there are probably quite a lot of illness memoirs out there now.
It's not an illness memoir, really,
isn't it?
I don't
What
think
is it?
so. I don't know. I don't think it lends itself to a 2-word
Don't you?
description. It's definitely a memoir, and you're definitely ill, but it's so much more than an illness memoir.
I don't even think it's a memoir.
No,
actually.
okay.
My editor wanted me to call it a memoir. I don't think it's a memoir because I didn't write it after the event.
No.
I wrote it from the trench. I wrote it as it was happening.
Yes.
I was lying there.
So it's journalism.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. I would call
but slightly
it that.
better written than the average.
I wrote it as it was happening to me.
Yeah.
I was lying in bed in a lot of pain with a doctor doing something to my genitalia, and I'll be writing a blog from that position.
So it's an eyewitness account of an extraordinary sequence of events.
I tell you, mate, if you don't write the stuff down, you really will forget it.
Yeah.
It's really important to keep a diary because remembering it 3 months later or a year later, you gloss over some of the most painful things.
And so you never struggled with that. Some people find writing it really difficult, don't they? Some people talk about it as being like squeezing out words. But we go back to your childhood precociousness and right through to essentially the minute you were capable of writing, even if you weren't physically capable, you were constructing this prose in your head, you were seeing it clearly. That's always come very naturally to you. You've never struggled to get stuff on paper.
Yeah, I was much more inhibited when I was younger, as most people are much more inhibited when they're younger. And then as you get older, you lose your inhibitions because your inhibitions are really about that you're fearful of what other people would think or what they might say. And most of these things that they might say or they think, they're in your head, they're not even real. But so eventually you grow out of that and you stop worrying about that, and I don't really mind. And if there is pushback, you take it, don't you?
Mm.
And you listen to it and you deal with it.
And it's all here. So it's not just the start. I mean, I know your sister found Buddha of Suburbia very difficult, and as you say, you don't hold back. You put it all out there. The new book, scatological is the only word. So you're doing the physical descriptions of the stuff that other people might be squeamish about, as well as the emotional stuff that people close to you might be squeamish about. Have you ever held anything back? Have you ever? Can you think of it? I'm not expecting you to tell me what it is if the answer is yes, but have you ever felt, do you know what, I probably won't push that button there, it wouldn't be fair?
Yeah, absolutely,
Right.
Obviously. I mean, everything I write, I would think about and weigh it up and think, should I say that or should I not say that? There's some remarks about my mum that I make in there, and I thought, and
That's what I was wondering about.
And Tracy said to me,
yes,
you shouldn't say that about your mum. Your mum was charming, etc., etc. But I thought, I feel like that, and I want to say that, and I'll put it out there and I'll say it, because that's how I feel, and I'm sure other people feel annoyed or angry or whatever with their parents too. So it's not such an unusual thing. So then you make up your mind and you say it. It's good to be on the edge as an artist. All the best artists are slightly on the edge. They're all kind of saying things that other people are afraid to say, and that's why you're a writer. That's your job, to say things other people can't bear to say. I've got writing students, and they tell me stuff, and I say, "Oh, that's great. Put that in your book." And they always say, "I can't say that. My mum won't like it."
yeah.
And you think, well, mate, you're done for then, because you've got to say the things that your mum doesn't want to hear. That's where you're free.
Gosh. So do I mean it, and can I back it up, or just do I mean it?
Or can I bear
The reaction.
the guilt and the reaction? Can I put up with that? Am I strong enough to put up with that? That's the question.
Do you still rage? Do you still rage against the injustice of it all, or are you becoming more sanguine?
I don't want to get used to being a paraplegic. I don't want to get used to it, but I am getting used to it.
Okay.
I mean, when I first came back, and you go out in your wheelchair on the street, and you're a much lower level than everyone else, you can see their stomachs, and then you go into all the shops and you have to look up, and it's particularly embarrassing. You're in Tesco's and the shelves are really high, and you're looking up like that, and you think, God, I'm just a little man down here. I'm at a dog's level, the dogs look me in the eye when they pass me in my wheelchair on the street, and you always feel embarrassed and small. But then you get used to it. You go out on the street in your wheelchair, and you stop noticing anymore. There's a guy the other day who I knew vaguely on the street, and he came up to me. He said, "Hi, Hanif, how are you?" and all that. And he didn't know what to do, and in the end, he patted me on the head 3 times. And I thought, you wouldn't do that to anyone else, mate, that you met on the street, would you? You wouldn't pat them on the head 3 times. He patted me on the head because I was disabled. And he felt sorry for me. It was like I was, 5 years old. And it's quite difficult for other people with disabled people.
Yes, of course.
They don't quite know what to do with you, where to look, and how to relate to you. It's quite odd that there's a kind of horror in their eyes. They think, that could be me, mate. That could be me one day.
So let me preface this question then by saying that I don't think it is. And I've tried semi-consciously to conduct this interview in a way that doesn't treat you as if it is. But is it currently, in 2024, is it the most interesting thing about you?
I think illness is a very interesting thing because we're all going that way, aren't we?
Yes.
I mean, I maybe one day I'll write a book called The Care Home Calls. I mean, we're going there.
Yeah.
And at the end of our lives, we are going to be dependent on the kindness of strangers. A Filipino nurse will be wiping your ass and feeding you, and your family will be, at home watching Newsnight. So I think it is interesting. I wouldn't say it's the most interesting thing, but I certainly think that with an aging population and people who are going to be ill for a much longer time, and with our dependence on other people, I don't think my case is at all unrepresentative. I don't think I'm exceptional. When you're in the hospital, you realise, in fact, that you are really like a lot of the other people here. You're a body, an animal that suffers and will die.
But what is exceptional is your ability to tell stories, to tell your story, or to tell all the stories that you've told over the course of your career. Whether it was the first unpublished novel that tempted a publisher around to your house on Sundays to help you with the work you were doing, or whether it's the latest, whether it's Shattered. So, is it an unalloyed blessing that the mental acuity remains complete? Is it just good that your brain is every bit as alert and as powerful as it would have been if you hadn't had the accident?
You mean otherwise what, James?
Well, I wondered whether this glaring self-scrutiny, this complete openness, the way you're approaching this in the way that you would have approached everything in your life, whether it can be a mixed, I don't want to say blessing, that's completely the wrong word, but whether things might have been a bit easier if things were a little bit fuzzier around the edges for you, conscious in terms of what's going on and everything.
I really like thinking.
Yes.
And I enjoy my own mind. And in hospital, I would sit in a chair staring at the wall for 5 hours sometimes, waiting for someone to turn up, let's say. And I had nothing else to do but to enjoy my memory of certain events and this and that, and to enjoy my mind, my thoughts and my ideas. I couldn't go on Twitter, I couldn't watch a movie, I couldn't do anything because I can't use my hands. So I enjoyed my mind in a way that I haven't, as it were, been able to, because I was too impatient I'll be watching the TV, or I'll be walking the dog, or doing something active. So actually being alone and being isolated is quite meditative, actually. I found it quite enjoyable to do nothing. After a time, your mind finds interesting things to do.
And you never would have discovered that, would you?
No.
Otherwise?
And I learned, particularly from my friend Salman Rushdie, I learned from him what he calls patience. He is a very impatient person, and I was, and he used to talk to me about patience, learning patience, being able to wait.
To wait.
Yeah.
Not for anything, but just to wait.
Or something will turn up, someone will turn up.
It's all gone a bit Beckett.
But yeah, but they do turn up.
Yes. We're out of time. I want to mention, obviously, the book Shattered, not a memoir, it should say on the cover. Buddha of Suburbia, the RSC have just adapted it.
It's tomorrow.
Opening
it's
at
the first preview.
I've seen it, actually.
Have you seen it? I haven't seen it.
No, I wondered. I saw it in Stratford.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, it slaps.
Is it?
Yeah, it definitely slaps.
Oh, great.
It's there's a lot going on, but I loved it, actually.
Oh, thanks, James. I haven't seen it. I'm looking forward to it.
And we should steer people as well towards the film that you made with Nigel Williams, which has just gone out as well on the BBC, in My Own Words, which is a very special documentary. And Nigel, of course, is my neighbour, so we should give him a shout as well.
Nigel Williams, top man. He did a good job with it. I haven't seen it because I'm afraid that I look fat in it, but I've heard it's good.
I just did a thing. And they showed it at the IMAX, which is the biggest screen in Europe.
Yeah.
And I'm in it very briefly, sitting down. And you're right. You'd never ever go and see yourself on the IMAX.
No.
Not even if you've got any worries in that department. It's the worst imaginable thing you can do.
Yeah.
I usually end by asking what ambitions people have left. And I wasn't sure I would ask you that, but I definitely will.
You think I'll have no ambitions because I'm paraplegic?
No, I just thought it might seem a banal question at the end of this conversation, but
I want to write. I want to do another book.
Yeah.
I wrote a book called Shattered. I'm writing another book called Still Shattered. And I want to do write a movie with two of my sons, Ashton and Carlo. See whether we can do that based on my experiences. So I really need a future. When what happened to me happens to you, you really need the future. You really got to believe in the future, because what happened to you is so dark and so depressing. You've got to believe in something.
Hanif Kureishi, thank you.
Thank you, James.